You might be surprised to hear what happened when our HOA president decided to demolish my sister's wheelchair ramp while she was at work. What she didn't realize was that my sister is not just any resident, she's the state governor. This was about to become a significant mistake for our neighbor, Karen, who leads the HOA. But how did this situation draw in our entire neighborhood and even reach a national audience? Let's start with the violation notice on our front door. It was the fifth one this month, all centered around Sarah's ramp. I crumpled it up and added it to my growing collection of warnings issued by Karen. Just then, I heard Sarah's electric wheelchair approaching from behind me. "Another love letter from our charming neighbor?" she asked with a weary smile. The dark circles under her eyes reflected the exhaustion from her new job, but she never complained, neither about work, the accident that put her in the wheelchair 6 months ago, nor about Karen's ongoing harassment. You'd think being the HOA president would keep Karen busy enough to avoid focusing on us. Yet there she was, again snapping pictures of our ramp from her driveway. Her stylish hair and designer outfit couldn't mask the disdain on her face. I still remember the day we installed that ramp. We followed every rule, hired a licensed contractor, got the proper permits, and even matched the paint to our house's trim. But Karen didn't care. She showed up before the concrete had even dried, waving the HOA rulebook as if it were a wand. Section 8, paragraph 3 clearly states that all external modifications must be approved by the board, she said, her voice dripping with feigned concern. We have to maintain our property values, you understand? What frustrated me most was how Karen kept scheduling HOA meetings about our ramp at times when Sarah couldn't attend. But honestly, even if Sarah had been free, she was too busy with her duties as governor. We had chosen to keep that part of her life private, allowing her some space to recover. Just last week, I caught Karen taking measurements of the ramp, seemingly up to her usual antics again. Early one morning, I found myself measuring things with a tape measure when I confronted Karen about her actions. She insisted she was simply fulfilling her responsibilities as the HOA president. Trusting my instincts, I began to document everything, recording videos, saving her notices, and keeping a detailed log of our interactions. It felt like we might need this information down the line. That particular morning felt different. As I helped Sarah into her car for her physical therapy appointment, I noticed Karen huddled with two men in suits near her house. They were pointing at our wheelchair ramp and gesturing animatedly. One man was jotting down notes while the other took pictures. A sense of unease washed over me. I turned to Sarah and said, "Maybe it's time we show them who they're dealing with." But Sarah shook her head firmly. "I won't use my position for special treatment. We'll go through the right channels." Despite her calm demeanor, I felt the weight of the situation grow as I watched Karen's sly smile while she handed thick manila envelopes to the men. It struck me that following the rules might not be enough this time. I pulled out my phone and started recording again, capturing Karen as her voice carried across our lawns. "Yes, we'll need that bulldozer here first thing tomorrow morning. The board has already approved the removal." My heart sank. Surely they wouldn't really tear down a wheelchair ramp, would they? As Sarah's car turned the corner, I rushed inside to check our security cameras and grab our folder of permits. But what I discovered within those files changed everything. It was a finding that could alter the course of our struggle against Karen. Later, as I sat down for breakfast, I heard the distant rumble of heavy machinery outside. My spoon clattered into my bowl as I rushed to the window. To my shock, there stood Karen in her iconic red blazer and perfectly styled blonde hair, directing a man in a construction hat who was nodding in agreement. I quickly grabbed my phone and ran outside, still half asleep as the morning sun struggled to break through. A bright yellow bulldozer loomed ominously in our driveway, its metal blade gleaming in the light. Two workers in orange vests were measuring the ramp with yellow tape measures, while Karen clutched a stack of papers like they were priceless artifacts. I called out, my voice shaking more than I'd like to admit, "What do you think you're doing?" Karen turned to me with that overly cheerful smile she always wore at HOA meetings. "Oh, good," she said, clearly reveling in the moment. "Welcome home," she called out, striding toward me in her stylish heels, which sank slightly into the freshly cut grass. "I have an emergency order from the HOA board about your ramp. This structure violates community guidelines, specifically Section 4.23. She waved a paper in front of me, then quickly pulled it back before I could take a look. I took a deep breath, just like Sarah taught me during her campaign speeches, and responded calmly. "Karen, we submitted all the necessary paperwork. We even have approval from the city." "Ah, but the city isn't the HOA, dear," she interrupted with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "As president of the board, it's my responsibility to uphold our community standards. This ramp is an eyesore and is affecting property values. Just look at how it clashes with the neighborhood's look." At that moment, I heard the bulldozer rev its engine, and anxiety washed over me. I quickly pulled up the property maps on my phone, the ones Sarah had urged me to save. They clearly showed our property lines and the associated permits. "This is illegal. You can't just demolish someone's property without proper notice or a court order." Karen let out a laugh, a high-pitched sound that made me shiver. "Notice was given 3 weeks ago via certified mail. We even have the receipt." She produced another document, flaunting a signature I didn't recognize. I instinctively reached for my phone to call Sarah, but it went straight to voicemail. Of course, she was stuck in a closed-door budget meeting today. I tried reaching her assistant and even her security team, but no one was picking up. As construction workers began placing orange cones around our driveway, one of them seemed unsure. I noticed him checking his paperwork repeatedly, whispering to his colleague and pointing at something that seemed off. "If you go through with this," I warned, my voice becoming stronger, "you'll be hearing from our lawyers. This is a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act." In an effort to document everything, I started live streaming on my phone, making sure to capture every detail. For a moment, Karen's smile faltered as I spoke. "The HOA is exempt from no law," I shouted, my voice echoing enough to draw attention from neighboring houses. I noticed our elderly neighbor, Mr. Rodriguez, peek out from his front door before quickly retreating back inside upon seeing Karen. But she had already turned back to the bulldozer operator, giving him a sharp nod. The machine roared to life, its treads crunching against our driveway. I felt a sense of dread as the blade lowered toward the ramp that had taken us weeks to install correctly. What was about to happen? I held my phone steady, telling Karen, "You're making a huge mistake." She looked back at me, her eyes icy, though a smile lingered on her face. The real mistake, in my view, was letting this huge project go ahead in the first place. Sometimes, people need a reminder that rules are in place for a good reason. The bulldozer's blade scraped against the edge of our ramp with a harsh screech, and I kept recording as pieces of our hard work began to fall apart. What Karen and the others didn't notice was that Mr. Rodriguez had returned with his camera, and more neighbors were coming outside, phones raised to capture the scene. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah's head of security. "Stay calm. Keep recording. Help is 3 minutes out." For the first time that morning, I smiled. It was almost amusing to watch Karen orchestrate the destruction, lost in her triumph. She had no idea that black SUVs were turning onto our street or that distant sirens were growing louder. Sometimes, the biggest mistakes come from missing small details, like not realizing your quiet neighbor is actually one of the most influential people in the state. Karen was about to discover that the hard way. I can still picture how our peaceful suburban street transformed into a scene straight out of a movie. Just as Karen was relishing her victory, high-fiving her friends over their removal of what she deemed an eyesore, the first black SUV turned the corner. One followed another, and soon, red and blue lights flashed all around. My hands trembled as I pressed record on my phone. This was going to be something to remember. Karen's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to bewilderment as 3 state police cruisers arrived, along with 5 identical black government vehicles. Neighbors who had been watching from their curtains all day now spilled onto their lawns, sensing that something significant was unfolding. "What's all this?" Karen asked, her voice faltering. "This is a private neighborhood matter." At that moment, Sarah's lead security detail emerged, scanning the area before opening the back door of the center SUV. The street fell silent as my sister rolled out in her wheelchair, wearing her official governor's blazer and a serious expression I only recognized from press conferences. "Actually, Mrs. Thompson," Sarah announced, her voice firm and clear, "this became a state matter the moment you violated federal regulations." As Sarah wheeled forward, her security team moved smoothly around her, creating a strong presence. Nearby, Karen's emotions flickered across her face like changing traffic lights. "State property?" she gasped, disbelief written all over her. Meanwhile, Sarah calmly pulled out her phone. "Would you like to see the deed? Or should we talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act first? I'm quite familiar with Title II after signing new protections just a month ago." The crowd of neighbors grew, with at least a dozen phones recording the unfolding scene. I noticed Mrs. Jenkins from across the street was already streaming live on Facebook. "But the HOA bylaws clearly state," Karen stammered, clutching her precious violation notices like a lifeline. "Interesting you mention those," Sarah interjected, directing her assistant to step forward with a thick binder. "My legal team has been reviewing your HOA's bylaws all afternoon. Want to hear what we found?" I watched as Karen's HOA board members began retreating, a wise choice. Sarah paused, letting the tension build. "There are multiple violations of state housing laws, discriminatory practices," she revealed, before adding for effect, "and irregular financial records going back 3 years. Gasps rippled through the crowd. I focused on Karen as her face drained of color, like the violation notices she clung to. "This isn't," she stuttered. "I didn't know," she continued, but Sarah quickly replied, "that I was the governor, or that bulldozing a disabled person's access ramp without proper notice or permits is a federal offense." Just then, 2 state investigators stepped forward, notebooks in hand. I noticed news vans beginning to appear at the end of our street. "Mrs. Thompson," one investigator said, "we'll need you to come with us to answer some questions about today's events and these financial discrepancies." As Karen was led away, muttering about property values and HOA regulations, Sarah turned to address the crowd. Even from her wheelchair, surrounded by the remnants of our ramp, she exuded leadership. "My fellow neighbors," she began, "today we have a chance to discuss what community truly means." She gestured to the ruined ramp. "This isn't just about me or my access to my home. It's about everyone's right to live with dignity in their own community." The expressions in the crowd shifted from shame and anger to something deeper, understanding. As I watched Karen being escorted away, it felt like a pivotal moment for all of us. As I sat in the car, holding on to her HOA rulebook, a thought crossed my mind. What would become of our peaceful neighborhood after such a chaotic evening? More specifically, how many other HOAs were engaging in the same questionable practices that Karen had been pulling off for years? The day after the bulldozing incident, I woke up to my phone buzzing incessantly. Our security camera footage had gone viral, and news vans were already parking outside our house. Yet that wasn't even the wildest part. My old high school friend, who is now a civil rights lawyer, called with surprising news about Karen's history with HOAs. When I opened the files he shared, I was stunned. Karen had faced lawsuits 3 times before for similar actions in other neighborhoods, but each time, she managed to settle quietly and move on to a new community to target. This time, however, she'd picked the wrong house on the wrong day. Sarah, our incredible governor, didn't just get frustrated. She took action. She organized an emergency press conference right on our front lawn, with the remains of the destroyed ramp scattered behind her. Reporters were eager to hear when she produced a stack of papers, revealing that Karen had not only violated federal disability laws, but had also broken 17 different state housing regulations. Then, our elderly neighbors began to step forward, sharing their own experiences. Mrs. Chen from across the street explained how Karen had forced her to remove her medical garden. Mr. Rodriguez provided documentation showing he had been fined for installing a wheelchair lift for his veteran father. Even the usually quiet Baker family spoke out about threats they faced over their autistic son's sensory-friendly playground equipment. Suddenly, the neighborhood I once knew felt changed. People were engaging with one another, recounting their stories, and standing united. In response to the growing backlash, Karen attempted to call an emergency HOA meeting to address what she claimed were baseless accusations. But to her dismay, only her two staunch supporters from the board showed up. Meanwhile, Sarah had invited disability rights advocates to our home, and half the neighborhood came to learn about accessible housing rights. Just when we thought the situation couldn't escalate further, someone leaked Karen's HOA financial records. To our astonishment, it turned out she had been pocketing the fines she collected to fund her own home renovations, falsely claiming they were community-approved improvements. The HOA's lawyer even decided to quit. 3 board members stepped down, expressing their frustrations in emails that unexpectedly made their way to the local news. Despite the backlash, Karen remained defiant. The next morning, she showed up at our house with a cease and desist letter, demanding we stop what she called spreading lies. What she didn't anticipate was walking into a meeting between Sarah and the state housing commissioner, who was keen to examine every decision Karen had made as HOA president over the past 5 years. The look on Karen's face when she realized her grip on power was slipping was almost worth all the drama. Almost. What was truly satisfying was seeing our neighbors install signs for accessible housing in their yards, one after another, until Karen's house was the only one left without one. News helicopters hovered above, capturing it all, and by sunset, our story was making headlines nationwide. As I watched our neighbors gather in the yard that evening, sharing their experiences and discussing plans for a more inclusive HOA, I found myself pondering how a single wheelchair ramp had sparked such a powerful movement. But the night still held surprises. Sarah had received some intriguing documents regarding the relationship between the bulldozing company and Karen's private contracting business. The following morning, my phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from neighbors recounting their own HOA horror stories. News reporters were also reaching out for interviews, but what truly stood out was an email from Mrs. Rodriguez, our elderly neighbor. She had been fined by Karen for having a garden gnome, and now had evidence of Karen breaking other rules. I printed out the HOA guidelines and spent the entire day highlighting the sections Karen had blatantly ignored. Sarah's legal team discovered that Karen had never even filed the proper paperwork to become HOA president. She just took over when the previous president moved away, and everyone else stayed silent. The more we investigated, the more problems we uncovered. Then, something incredible happened. Our case caught the attention of Tommy Chin, a well-known YouTube lawyer who focuses on unjust housing regulations. He flew in to meet with Sarah and offered to help us sue Karen and the HOA at no cost. His video on our situation went viral, amassing millions of views within just one day. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Karen called for an emergency HOA meeting. But this time, it was different. The community center was filled to capacity, with many neighbors who had previously remained unheard finally sharing their stories. Karen had a habit of bullying others, like Mr. Jenkins. She once pressured him to take down a treehouse that his daughter had built. The Wilson family also felt her sting when she criticized their Christmas lights, claiming they were too bright. Then Sarah took the floor at a community meeting. She didn't just talk about the ramp issues. She unveiled her ambitious plan for a new law designed to protect homeowners from the abuse of homeowners associations, HOAs. The crowd erupted in cheers when she announced it would be called the Right to Home Happiness Act. Things took a turn when we discovered security camera footage that showed Karen had lied on official documents, stating she had permission to bulldoze the ramp. This evidence was enough for her lawyer to drop her case just 2 days later. Watching Karen pack up her favored row of bushes, the same ones she had insisted everyone mimic, was quite a sight. Now, the new HOA board has truly made a difference. They transformed what used to be an office for violations into a community help center. Instead of sending out fines, they now welcome new neighbors with baskets of goodies. They even launched a program to assist elderly residents with home repairs. Sarah's ramp was rebuilt, and this time local artists painted it with beautiful flowers and added soft glowing lights for the evenings. Children in the neighborhood now proudly claim it's the prettiest spot on our street. Last week, Sarah hosted a barbecue in our backyard for everyone. It was heartwarming to see people laughing and enjoying each other's company where Karen once stood, shouting about lawn height regulations. It made me realize something important. Sometimes the hardest moments can spark the best changes. Remember that bulldozer company? They have since begun offering free ramp installations for disabled residents throughout the state, and their CEO even made a personal apology to Sarah. They also started a scholarship fund to support students interested in studying disability rights law. The biggest surprise came yesterday when I was promoted to lead the state's new homeowner protection office. My first task will be teaching other neighborhoods how to turn their HOAs from bullies into supporters. Sarah says we're just getting started, and with all that has changed in just 1 year, I truly believe her. Our story has even made it into school textbooks as an example of standing up against unfair rules. Yet the real victory isn't in those headlines or new laws. It's found in the small joys, like watching Mrs. Rodriguez's garden gnome collection grow or seeing kids play freely on their front lawns, no longer fearing violation notices. Last week, Karen's old house sold. A new family has moved in, bringing along 3 kids and 2 dogs. It's wonderful to see how the community is thriving. In their front yard, there was a wheelchair ramp built for their grandmother. Interestingly, no one complained about it. Instead, 5 neighbors came together to lend a hand with the installation. That moment made it clear to me that we hadn't just transformed a homeowners association. We had also shifted perspectives.